Well, welcome to my kitchen. This is another site of power and framing systems and ecologies of food. I think there's an ecology lurking back there that I may need to take care of later. But it's worth changing spaces every once in a while and maybe even changing costume just to take a different perspective on this great subject of food and politics, gastronomy, and power. And one of the first things I wanted to dive into a little bit was the notion of ecosophy. Ecosophy is very much a starting point for a lot of my own work in food, and it may be a helpful entry point for understanding the politics of gastronomy as well. The term comes from this wonderful book, Felix Guattari's The Three Ecologies, or Les Trois Ecologies, since it was written in French. And Guattari was very interested in effectively proposing a way forward for humanity to deal with some of the environmental and ecological and biogeophysical problems that we're creating for ourselves in the world because of questions of politics, but also questions of society and questions of the self. And for Guattari, ecosophy is his tool or his device for perceiving power at different scales and of different types. And so, before getting back to his understanding and his interpretation of ecosophy, I want to think about those different types and the different scales of power. Because, of course, power exists in very large ways and very small ways. Power is sometimes a process of giving something away to someone else. Sometimes it's a process of taking. But processes of exchange are always inherent to power. And so if there's exchange, then there's different kinds of power, and there are different sites of power, and there are often very different scales of power. Certainly, countries and politicians operate at a fairly large scale, one might say. But the refrigerator or the jars behind me or even my body is a site of power that's at a more contained scale. And then if you start thinking about power in other terms, the power to maintain or control or to let go of different forms of energy, things like atoms and molecules have their own kind of power because they wield a source of potential energy that can be released under certain conditions. A stove is a site of power because it also has the power to release, capacity to release energy at different times. A water faucet has power because of the ways that it can allow liquid to pour through it and then let you engage in the power of washing your dishes. Or at a larger scale, engage in the power of generating electricity through a hydroelectric dam. So all these different things, power and energy, are related. And sometimes it's worth thinking about energy as well in terms of one of the resources that politics draws upon. So in the world of food, of course, plants and animals and our abilities to control them and frame them in corrals or in gardens or in kitchens or in refrigerators, there's a power inherent to the energy that those things possess. But then things like water and oil, very specifically, are also always implicated because those are elements that have the potential to release energy and therefore are implicated in systems of power. Two different notions are worth differentiating a bit here, and that's the difference between power and agency. So again, many different definitions and descriptions exist for both words, but one of the nice things about the idea of agency is that it communicates that a thing might have the power to act, but not necessarily a power that comes from a motivation. So I talked about water flowing from a faucet. Of course, there's a kind of agency in that water in that it flows, it moves, it has the capacity to push things around in your sink or perhaps dissolve different substances from your dishes as you're washing them. Water has a kind of agency in the way that it moves and flows and interacts with other things, but most of us would probably say that water does not have much intentionality. Water acts under the force of gravity. That's another kind of power that's exerted upon it. But then it acts to do things like erode. It can create a canyon just by flowing. It can create all sorts of effects in the natural environment by dissolving things and then bringing those dissolved substances into other bodies of water, or evaporating and leaving them on high and dry ground. So all of those are kind of agencies that water has, even though, as I said, most of us would agree that it's not doing it on purpose or because it has a will. But agency, nonetheless, is a kind of power and operates within different flows of power. And so when you start talking about things having agency and things flowing between different sites or sources of power, then one wants to think about where those different things interact, where those things come together. And this is what I would call different points of articulation within systems of power. Perhaps sites where one form of power is translated into another. Coming back to the example of the hydroelectric dam, that's a point of articulation between the potential energy of water flowing from a higher piece of ground to a lower piece of ground, and then the transformation of that potential energy into kinetic energy, which is maybe something that turns a turbine or generates, through various mechanical systems, electricity. So in that case, the potential energy of water is transformed into the usable energy of electricity, and then goes out into the electric grid, becomes something that humans use. That power station is a site of transformation, or it's a point of articulation between systems of power. All sorts of other points of articulation exist, and this is where Guattari's notion of ecosophy becomes important, because ecosophy specifically deals with how different types of environments, different types of ecologies, as he would name them, interact and have effects on each other. How they are literally articulated together like a metal fence that is both flexible but also somewhat rigid, and how an effect over here produces an effect over here because of this point of articulation. So points of articulation are important in the politics of gastronomy because they are often places where agency may be transformed or translated into power. Coming back again to the question of hydroelectricity, here in Canada, hydroelectricity is incredibly important, particularly in Quebec, for many of the First Nations communities, because they have signed treaties with large power corporations to allow their lands to be flooded in order to create reservoirs and damming systems and then hydroelectric plants. So there, they are in some ways giving up their agency over the land, giving up their power to use their own space to hunt and fish and trap, and yet they are receiving economic benefit. So there's a translation of land use and rights and previous practices into, money, and into a different kind of power because you've now entered into a relationship with a provincial body, into a relationship with a body that makes electricity, and so those are more conventional Western systems of power that have been created or translated from a more indigenous system of power. That's a very complex system that involves, yes, food, as well as regulation, as well as all sorts of technologies, and also, of course, what we tend to call the natural or the biogeophysical environment. Okay, that's a lot. That's a lot of different systems to think about. And when they all come together, we end up with some potentially very valuable outcomes, things like electricity, and also some potentially very damaging outcomes, including things like loss of culture and loss of connection to the land among people who have been very connected to it for a very, very long time. This is where, once again, Guattari becomes important, because he talks about ecosophy as being the socio-political articulation between the three ecological registers. And he calls those three ecological registers the environment, what I would call the biogeophysical environment, the stuff out there; society, which is in some ways an ecology of human beings, the relationships between individuals and groups of individuals, as well as the governing rules and systems that structure us into societies. And then the ecological register of what he calls the self, the relationship that I have with me. And so again, this is a scaling of different types of power. At the close-in scale, there's me, myself, my consciousness, my being. Then at a larger scale, potentially, of humans and of numbers, we have society, And those are the relationships that I, me, have with them, other. And then beyond that, there's the largest system of the world, or even the universe. And that environment is the space and also some of the framing systems that help shape how societies interact within themselves and with other societies. So you can see how the scaling of different ecologies then also creates implications for the scaling of different flows of power among me, my society, and my environment, and among the different elements of power that reside within those different ecologies. Put them all together, you have a very, very complex system. And whereas ecosophy does not necessarily answer the questions that those systems produce, it helps to start to perceive where the complexities reside and maybe the places that we should be focusing our attention. And I would say those places to focus our attention when it comes to the politics of gastronomy are the points of articulation between the self, the society, and environment. So from Guattari's notion of ecosophy, one of the places that I like to go is Jane Bennett, another one of my favorite authors. And she deals in this book, Vibrant Matter, A Political Ecology of Things. She deals with the agency and potentially also the power that non-human things have, including non-living things. She's very interested in how different material objects, different physical spaces, different conceptual spaces, and even how language and regulation and policy all come together in what she calls an assemblage of agency. She doesn't actually say this individual non-living thing has the capacity to act on its own. She talks in terms of confederacies or assemblages or situations in which elements that were there or that were brought into that situation by a more intentional hand like a human being's, those situations then produce effects in the world. And that effect is what we then say is the outcome of agency. Nicely, it means that food, necessarily, as one of those non-human things in the world, also participates in an assemblage or confederacy that might have power to bring about some kind of change. It questions whether or not food on its own has agency, or food through its articulations with human beings and societies and the natural environment, whether that's how it has agency. Ultimately, one of the questions is, does it matter if this thing or that thing has power or agency on its own? Because this thing or that thing is never separated from the rest of the agents or the elements within a confederacy or assemblage. No human being is isolated from their society or their environment, and no individual part of that society or environment is isolated from any other part of it. And again, this is why ecosophy is so important, because it draws our attention to those points of articulation that are constantly present, but may be ignored, may not be credited with their role in bringing about different effects of the politics of gastronomy.